The Dark Secret of Weatherend by John Bellairs, Chapter 1. On a hilly, winding road in rural Minnesota, a boy named Anthony Monday was pedaling furiously on his bicycle. The year was 1954, and it was August, and it was broiling hot. Anthony was 14 years old, with a thin, pinched face and a long, pointed nose. He was tall, skinny, and muscular, and today he was wearing cut-off jeans and sneakers with an old soiled white t-shirt. He was also wearing a red leather cap with a scrunched peak. Anthony had a thing about red leather caps. He wore them summer and winter, in good weather and bad. And when one wore out, he got another exactly like it and scrunched the peak until it looked right. Anthony was going to see his best friend, an elderly lady named Miss Eels. They had met one day in a drugstore in Hoosac, an industrial town on the Mississippi River where Anthony lived, and they had gotten to be friends in a hurry. Now Anthony had an after-school job as a page at the Hoosac Public Library, which he had gotten through Miss Eels, who was the head librarian. Anthony liked Miss Eels because she was fun to be around. They played chess and Scrabble and went places together. Also, Miss Eels listened to Anthony. He could tell her his troubles and his secrets and know that she would not blab about him to anybody else. On this particular day, however, he was not burdened with any secrets that needed to be told. He was just going out to see Miss Eels for fun. She was working at a branch library in the tiny town of Rolling Stone, which was 3 miles from Hoosac. But 3 miles is not far to go when you are young and strong, and Anthony was whizzing along at a pretty good clip. Bits of gravel snapped from under the bike's tires as he went, making a sound like popcorn popping. On Anthony rode, legs pumping, singing a song. Meanwhile, out in Rolling Stone, Miss Eels was in a rotten mood. She was on the lawn behind the little library building, swinging a golf club. It was a 9-iron, and she swung it viciously and wildly. As she flailed away, clouds of grassy earth flew into the air. The lawn was full of holes where Miss Eels had dug divots, and it was hard to tell whether she was trying to hit the celluloid practice ball or just trying to destroy the lawn. Miss Eels was a small bird-like woman with a wild nest of white hair on her head. She was 68 years old and wore glasses, but behind them, her bright eyes were lively and inquisitive. Normally, she was cheerful, but right now she was angry, frustrated, and bored because she was stuck managing the branch library for the summer in this tiny hick town where nothing ever happened. It was true that the library building was quite charming. It was made of red brick and was only 1 story high with green shutters and flower boxes under the windows. But all the charming buildings in the world would not have made Miss Eels feel any better about Rolling Stone. So why was she out here instead of in Hoosac where she wanted to be? Well, it was Mrs. Oxenstern's fault. Mrs. Hanson Oxenstern was the head of the library board and a very important person in the city of Hoosac. Miss Eels had never been friendly with Mrs. Oxenstern, but for a long time she had tried to fight down her dislike of the other woman. Then one day Mrs. Oxenstern decided that it would be nice to turn the children's room on the 2nd floor of the library into a genealogy room. Genealogy is the study of family trees and ancestors, and it can be fascinating if you like that sort of thing. Miss Eels felt that genealogy was about as interesting and important as bottle cap collecting. A long and bitter argument ensued in which Miss Eels told Mrs. Oxenstern that she was a stupid, pompous busybody who liked to throw her weight around. Mrs. Oxenstern was furious. She stormed out of Miss Eels' library and slammed the door behind her. Mrs. Oxenstern was pretty powerful, and she would have fired Miss Eels if she could have. But luckily, Miss Eels had been at the Hoosac Library for a long time, and she had tenure. All Mrs. Oxenstern could do was force Miss Eels to fill in at the branch libraries around Hoosac if there was an emergency. Of course, one day, just such an emergency arose. It was the beginning of the summer, and old Mrs. Trombley of the Rolling Stone branch was so sick she had to be hospitalized. In no time, Mrs. Oxenstern had happily sent Miss Eels over to take her place. So here Miss Eels was, bored silly and angry a lot of the time. Miss Eels stopped swinging the golf club and looked around. She felt ashamed of herself. Normally, she was not the destructive type, not intentionally anyway. She was kind of clumsy, and she was always spilling things or knocking vases off tables, but she tried hard to be tidy. Now, as she looked around, she realized that she had been taking out her anger and frustration on the lawn. Sighing, she threw down the club and walked around to the front of the library. She felt sweaty, so she took a handkerchief out of the pocket of her skirt and wiped her face. Then she folded her arms and looked around in a discontented way. The library stood at a place where 2 country roads crossed. Off to the left, at the top of a low bank, was the Spanish-American War Monument, a tall granite shaft with some names on it, and 2 grim old black cannons. Across the street was a variety store, and next to it stood a dignified white-framed house with 4 tall brick chimneys. It was a very picturesque scene, but there was not a soul stirring anywhere. It was 3 in the afternoon, and there was nobody, absolutely nobody, at the library but Miss Eales. She was so bored that she felt like crying. "Oh, please, God, let something happen soon," she said to herself, and then, as if in answer to her prayer, around the corner in a cloud of dust came Anthony. "Anthony! Anthony! Hi! How are you?" Calling out and waving like a madwoman, Miss Eales ran pell-mell across the grass. Anthony swerved his bike off the road. He coasted along the driveway for a short distance, and then he hit the brakes, vaulted nimbly to the ground, and walked his bike the rest of the way to where Miss Eales was standing. "Hi, Miss Eales," he said, grinning cheerfully. "I had the day off today, so I thought I'd come out and see you. How are you doing, huh?" Miss Eales made a sour face. "Don't ask. Actually, if you want to know, I'm bored out of my ever-loving mind. About 3 people a day come in to use this stupid little library, plus 1 or 2 tourists who need to use the bathroom. Thank God you stopped by. I think that in another hour I would have been pitching rocks at passing cars. Come on inside and I'll grab you a Coke." Anthony followed Miss Eales into the tiny library. It was hot and stuffy inside, even though all the windows were open. A small fan was whirring noiselessly at the top of a filing cabinet, but it didn't seem to help much. There were only 2 rooms here, a long one full of books on steel shelves, and the disorderly little office where Miss Eales' desk was. Books and papers were strewn everywhere, and there were Coke stains and tea stains and coffee stains all over. On the desk blotter, on the papers, on the floor, and even on the walls. Miss Eales had had a few accidents. "Welcome to the hermit's cave," said Miss Eales sourly. She swept dust off a chair with her hand and told Anthony to sit down. Then she went over into a dark corner where a small ancient refrigerator was humming quietly. She opened it up, took out 2 bottles of Coke, and brought them over to the drain board of a built-in sink that stood by the window. Humming pleasantly, Miss Eales reached into a drawer, took out a bottle opener, and started to pry the cap off one of the Coke bottles. Suddenly, she let out a blood-curdling yelp. The opener clattered to the drain board. Clutching at her injured hand, Miss Eales rushed past Anthony and made a beeline for the bathroom. The bathroom door slammed, and from behind it, Anthony heard the sound of running water. A few minutes later, Miss Eales came back. On the index finger of her right hand was a blood-stained Band-Aid. "There are certain things," she said with a despairing sigh, "which were not meant to be, Anthony. We were not meant to have ice-cold Coke today, so why don't we climb into my car and take a drive in the country? It'll cool us off, and then we can get really cool by having an ice cream at the Blue Moon ice cream stand down in Dresbach. How does that grab you?" Anthony said it sounded like a good idea. He went outside to lock up his bike behind the library. When he walked back around front, he found Miss Eales sitting in her 14-year-old Dodge with the motor idling. The car was mud-spattered and covered with rust spots and had a bent coat hanger for a radio antenna. Miss Eales had driven it over 204,000 miles, but since it still started every morning, she saw no reason to buy a new one. "Okay, now," said Miss Eales, waving cheerfully from the open car window. "Let's make ourselves scarce. The library isn't supposed to close till another hour, so if any of Miss Oxenstern's spies are hiding in the drain pipes or in the tall grass, I guess I've had it. But at this point, I could care less. Come on, move it or lose it, as my father used to say." Anthony climbed in, and they were off. For miles and miles, they drove along winding, rutty, bumpy back roads. The air that rushed in through the open windows was like an evening breeze off the sea. As they cruised along, Anthony tilted his head back, eyes closed, and said, "Ah," several times. Miss Eales began to whistle. She was a great whistler, and she did a medley that had been popular in the 40s, like Racing with the Moon, the Victory Polka, and Merseydotes. Uphill and downhill, over a railroad grade crossing, and through a sleepy country town they went. Anthony felt very relaxed. He even took off his red leather cap and let the air whip through his matted, sweaty hair. Soon he was drifting off into a pleasant afternoon snooze until the car slowed down and rolled to a halt. Anthony blinked and sat up. He looked around. They had pulled off onto the sandy shoulder of a two-lane blacktop that wound among steep hills. On their right, the ground fell away. Anthony saw a long, sloping pasture where cows were lazily munching grass. On the left, a saggy wire fence ran along the roadside. Beyond it, a fairly steep hill rose up to the skyline. Atop the hill stood a gray stone building with pinnacles on the roof. Anthony was bewildered and annoyed. Why on earth had Miss Eels stopped here? He turned to look at her. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel, gazing dreamily up at the building on the hill. "I bet you're wondering why we've stopped," she said without turning. "Well, I wanted to show you Weatherend. That's the name of the estate up there. It's all done in fake Gothic with fancy pointed arches and pinnacles and ball flowers. There are fountains and funny courtyards with statues on columns, and I would give my left ear to own the place. It's totally deserted now. Nobody's lived in it for the last 40 years. What do you think, Anthony didn't know. His head was still full of cobwebs. All around them the landscape dreamed in the simmering heat of the August afternoon. Now that the car had stopped, Anthony was beginning to feel sticky and uncomfortable. Rivulets of sweat were running down his back. What was there to look at? Some old rundown building on a hill? Anthony wanted to get moving again so they could get to the ice cream stand before it closed. "Yeah, it's nice," he muttered, and he threw a bored glance toward the far-off gray building. He wanted to add, "Let's hit the road, okay?" But he knew that would not be very polite. Tensely, he waited for Miss Eels to start the car again. But she didn't. As Anthony watched curiously, she opened the car door and leaped nimbly out. Quickly, Miss Eels turned across the road and stopped in front of the sagging fence, which had two large red "No Trespassing" signs attached to it. Then she darted back, jumped into the car again, and took off her shoes. As Anthony watched, dumbfounded, Miss Eels reached into the back seat and came up with a pair of white sweat socks and two battered tennis shoes. She slipped the shoes on over her nylons and then started pulling on the tennis shoes. Anthony couldn't stand it any longer. At last he spoke. "Miss Eels," he said in an impatient voice, "what the heck is going on? Are you going to go on a hike or something?" Miss Eels grinned and leered at Anthony. "Correction! We are going on a hike, unless, of course, you want to sit in the car and fester." Anthony felt helpless. He knew Miss Eels pretty well. She could be klutzy. She could be vague. She could seem helpless and dithery, but when she really wanted to do something, she was like a runaway locomotive. He felt that he'd better go along. In any case, it would be better than waiting in the boiling hot car. So Anthony and Miss Eels climbed out and crossed the road. Anthony thought about the "No Trespassing" signs, and he almost laughed. He had been on hikes with Miss Eels in the past, and he knew that signs like that were a red cape waved in front of a bull. He had even seen her tear one down and trample on it. Miss Eels had funny views on a lot of subjects, and on the subject of private property, she was practically a socialist. Miss Eels swung herself quickly over the fence. Anthony followed, and they started up the hill. But as they climbed, Anthony could feel cold fear creeping over his body. What if there were stray dogs lurking? At one time, Anthony had liked dogs. If some mutt came ambling up to him, he would pet it and rub its muzzle. But then Anthony had a strange and frightening experience. A stray came after him late one night, barking furiously. Anthony panicked. He had started running, tripped over a stone, and broke his arm. Now, whenever he was in a lonely place, day or night, an unreasonable fear of dogs would steal over him. In his mind's eye, he would see the evil beasts leaping up out of unexpected places, snarling and yelping, with bared fangs and saliva dripping from their mouths. Anthony began to glance nervously to his right and to his left. He was ashamed of his fear and fought against it, but he couldn't do anything to make it go away. On they climbed. Now they were at the top of the hill. The building that they had seen from the road turned out to be a gray Gothic garage. It was like a miniature church with quatrefoils and buttresses and narrow-pointed windows. In the distance, on a hill that was a little higher than the one they were standing on, loomed the mansion of Weatherend. It was Gothic too, with a gray stone tower and a rose window and knobbly pointed decorations everywhere. But the windows were boarded. and the stone urns that stood on the terrace had been turned upside down. Everywhere the grass was long, rank, and full of weeds. Down in the shallow valley between the two hills, Anthony could see a flight of cracked stone steps leading up to a neglected overgrown garden. 2 headless sphinxes guarded the top of the stairs, and there were broken marble statues, overturned mossy benches, and weeds galore. Miss Eels waved her arm at the scene. "See, isn't this interesting? Wasn't it worth the climb, even in this filthy heat?" Anthony nodded. He thought the place looked like the setting for a murder mystery. Anthony was reading mysteries now. John Dickens Carr and Agatha Christie and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. If this were a murder mystery now, he thought, there would be a body down in the garden, somebody with his head bashed in or a knife in his back. But life wasn't like mystery novels. There weren't any bodies. There was just the heat and the buzzing of the flies and the feeling of loneliness that you get from looking at abandoned houses. Finally, Anthony broke the silence. "Who lived here, Miss Eels? He must have been pretty rich, don't you think?" "Pretty rich and pretty weird," agreed Miss Eels. "J.K. Borkman made his money from mining in the Iron Range up north of here, and when he settled down in this place at the age of 72, he decided that he wanted to do 2 things. First, he wanted to live the rest of his life in splendid isolation. Second, he wanted to study the weather." Anthony was startled. "The weather?" Miss Eels nodded firmly. "The weather. I know it sounds ridiculous, but some people are like that. I had an aunt who was nutty about the weather. She would check the weather reports in the newspapers twice a day, and she was always listening to the weather news on the radio. Well, Borkman was just the same. He filled his house with barometers and barographs and thermometers, and there was one of those whirly cup things on the roof that measured wind speed. And if you ask me why old Borkman had this nutty obsession, I'd have to say that I don't know. In my aunt's case, it was probably just something to do to keep from going bananas with boredom." Miss Eels sighed and gazed around. "It's a shame somebody doesn't buy this place and do something with it. You'd think the National Trust for Historical Preservation would be interested in it, but they aren't, and there aren't many millionaires who want to live in rural Minnesota. So the old place just sits and rots. I've come up here a few times to prowl, and I've never seen a soul. What do you suppose is this rather pretentious garage, eh? Is in this rather pretentious garage, eh? Shall we have a peek?" Anthony turned and looked at the stout, nail-studded wooden doors of the garage. He saw 2 twisty wrought iron door handles, held together by a chain that was fastened with a large and very rusty padlock. "But the door's locked," he said. "I wonder if that's true," said Miss Eels thoughtfully as Anthony watched. Miss Eels walked up to the door and yanked at the padlock. Flakes of rust showered down, and the lock sprang open. Grinning mischievously, Miss Eels removed the padlock. She threw it contemptuously into the weeds, and with a grand flourish whipped off the chain. Unfortunately, the flourish was a bit too dramatic, and the end of the chain whirled around and hit Miss Eels on the back of the neck. "Ow!" she yelled. "Why me, I ask? Why do these things happen to me?" She sighed and looked down at the chain in her hand. "Ah, well," she said wearily. "It's probably just a judgment on me because I'm a nosy old bat. Come on, Anthony, let's see what's inside." And with that, Miss Eels dropped the chain and tugged at one of the garage doors. Anthony grabbed the other door handle and pulled. With a dismal groaning sound, the doors shuddered open. In addition to the shut-up, musty smell that drifted out, there was an odd, clammy chill in the air, even on this hot day. Inside, everything was thickly coated with dust and dirt. Cobwebs festooned the grimy windows. It was so dark that it took Anthony's eyes a few seconds to get used to it. Gradually, though, he began to see things. Flower pots were stacked in one corner, and nearby were old gardening tools, rakes and hoes, and a hand-powered lawnmower. There was a sagging table with more flower pots on it, plus some trowels and a pair of stiff, dirty gardening gloves. At the back of the building, in the shadows, 4 large shapes loomed. Anthony was startled and afraid. "Hey, Miss Eels," he said, pointing. "What the heck are those things?" Miss Eels shrugged. "Darned if I know. Why don't we go find out?" And she walked boldly forward. At first, Anthony hung back. Then he pulled himself together and followed Miss Eels. The boards of the garage floor creaked as he moved cautiously forward. Now he could see what the 4 things were. Each one looked like a statue that a sculptor had given up on halfway through. From the rugged, chisel-marked stone slabs, hands and arms and bits of carved drapery protruded. Half-finished faces, blurred and indistinct and somehow sinister, stared out of the gloom. Oddly enough, the pedestal at the bottom of each statue was finished, squared off, and even polished. On each of the 4 bases stood letters. Letters stood out in relief. The statues had titles: Wind, Snow, Hail, and Lightning. Miss Eels folded her arms and stared for a full minute at the statues. Then she shook her head slowly and let out a long, low whistle. Boy, oh boy, she said in an awestruck tone. Would you look at these? If you didn't already think J.K. Borkman was a major fruitcake with citron chunks and almonds, this would convince you. This is incredible, Anthony, isn't it? What on earth do you think the old so-and-so had in mind? I don't know, Miss Eels. Anthony's voice was small and frightened. The feeling of nervousness that had crept up on him since he entered the garage was growing now. There was something about the 4 half-made statues that was incredibly ominous and forbidding. Anthony took a sudden step backwards. Quickly, his hand shot out and he grabbed Miss Eels' arm. Come on, he said. Let's get out of this place. It's giving me the creeps. Miss Eels stared curiously at the boy. If the statues were sending out evil vibrations, she certainly did not feel them. Anthony, calm down, she exclaimed in an annoyed voice, and she shook off his clutching hand. Good heaven, but you're nervous today. Does your mother let you drink coffee now? Anthony felt foolish. He was a bundle of nerves, and Miss Eels was as steady as a rock. Why wasn't she feeling what he was feeling? I just want to go, he said in a small, miserable voice. I can't explain it, but I've just kind of got the heebie-jeebies, you know what I mean? Miss Eels smiled sympathetically. She had her own little fusses and worries, and she knew they didn't make sense to anyone but herself. On the other hand, she was still feeling nosy and wanted to hang around just a few minutes more. We'll go in a couple of seconds, she said, giving Anthony a reassuring pat on the arm. I just want to have another wee peek at these statues. They're really quite... Ow! Oh! Ow! 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 Miss Eels had been moving forward as she talked. Suddenly she stumbled and slumped downward. Anthony saw instantly what had happened. A rotten board in the floor of the garage had given way. Miss Eels' right leg had sunk all the way up to the thigh, and the ragged edge of the board had raked her flesh. In a flash, Anthony was down on his knees alongside her. Oh my gosh, Miss Eels, he gasped. Are you all right? Are you all right? Miss Eels bit her lip, then she opened her mouth and let fly with a string of rather imaginative swear words. When she felt somewhat better, slowly and carefully she began to ease her injured leg up out of the hole. Dratted board! She muttered as she reached down and broke off the piece of wood that had gouged her leg. She and Anthony looked through the hole she had just made. Even though the light of the garage was dim, they could see, down on the hard ground under the floor, a small metal box. Ha! Snorted Miss Eels, and she reached down into the hole and came up with the box in her hands. What is it? Asked Anthony eagerly. He was a coin collector, and he was hoping it was a box full of Brasher doubloons or 1822 $5 gold pieces. Here, she said, and she handed the box to Anthony. It felt disappointingly light. While Anthony was wondering whether he ought to open it or not, Miss Eels got to her feet and began brushing her skirt with her hands. She winced because of the pain in her leg, and there were long, angry red scratches on her skin. Her nylon stocking had been ripped to shreds. I think I'd better go have Doc Lucier look at this before tetanus sets in, said Miss Eels wryly, staring at her injured leg. Why me? She sighed. As I've said many times before, why me? Ah, well, let's get going. Limping slightly and still wincing from the pain, Miss Eels made her way out of the garage. Anthony followed with the box in his hands. When he stepped into the sunlight, he heaved a sigh of relief. They were safe now. They were going on to the ice cream stand and then home. Anthony turned to Miss Eels, and he was about to ask her if she needed help getting down the hill when he heard something. There was a noise in the distance, a door slamming. Anthony turned and looked off toward the boarded-up mansion. The front door was open, and there was somebody standing out on the front steps. The figure was far away, but it looked like a man, and he was waving. He seemed cheerful and friendly. Anthony just raised his arm to wave back when he saw something that filled him with horror. A dog, a large black dog, rushed past the man and bounded down the steps of the terrace. It was coming toward them. Anthony and Miss Eels turned and ran lickety-split down the slope as fast as they could. Injured leg or not, Miss Eels was running hard. She threw it into high gear and passed Anthony, arms pumping like a marathon runner. Anthony was so astounded at the sight of Miss Eels running that he actually slowed down a bit, and so he had the chance to see her hike up her skirts and clear the bent fence in a lovely running jump. With the box still clutched to his chest, Anthony vaulted the fence too, and they both scrambled madly across the road. Judging from the sound of the barking behind them, the dog was not very far away. As Anthony tore around the front of the car, he saw, out of the corner of his eye, that the evil black dog had made it to the fence. He fumbled madly with the door and finally got it open. Slam! Now he was safe. Miss Eels was inside too, and she was searching madly in her junk-filled handbag for the keys. As she started the car, Anthony saw the terrifying sight of the dog leaping viciously at the driver's door. His claws clattered on the glass, and his barking was loud and frightening. Miss Eels turned her head and stuck out her tongue at the yelping beast. Then she threw the car into gear, and they shot off in a cloud of exhaust smoke. And that is the end of Chapter 1.